one of many people coming back for our centennial celebrations this weekend, but it seemed very appropriate to have Harry give the sort of centennial MDZ lunch, if you want to call it that. And I'm grateful to him for doing so. His topic's Pleistocene rewilding, lions in a den of Daniels. Go, Harry.
Thanks. So I'm going to have access to this. So nice to be back. It's really strange to look around this room and see faces that have changed. Some more than others. It's actually quite fascinating to see who's changed a lot and who's changed less. And I've changed. I have to say that one of the coolest things is to see Paul Fine, who was a natural history of the vertebrate student and then did his honors thesis on escape behavior in Scoloporus and Briones. He built this incredible apparatus that would fly these fake kestrels over Scoloporus on their boulders. It was like this big thing you had to crank. It was incredible. We didn't think it would work, and he went out there and did it, and it was published. And for years, I had it on my door as an example of undergraduate research. So wonderful to see you in particular, Paul. I'm going to tell you about sort of a second career I started about 3 or 4 years ago, involving this thing we call Pleistocene rewilding. And you might wonder why in the world I ever did this. I managed to make it almost my whole life without being involved in any controversy whatsoever. And in fact, I had a minor blip about 2001 when Mike Lee and I got in a squabble in Science involving the origin of snakes. And at that time, I considered that kind of like scary. It was so confrontational. I had no idea what was coming. Okay? This is controversial. So why did I do that? Well, there were sort of two or three things underlying this. One is I'd worked with dangerous snakes most of my life, and I'd become increasingly interested in whether or not, and if so how, humans can learn to live with dangerous animals. The second thing is that ever since my PhD work, I've been interested in the role of history, in evolutionary history, as a context for contemporary phenomena and how we deal with contemporary phenomena. And the third thing is that I'm increasingly impressed that the world really is going to hell. I mean, things are really going downhill bad. I mean, I've heard people have said to me with absolute confidence the polar bear will go extinct in the 21st century. Think about it. I mean, we might lose a third of the frogs on Earth within our lifetime. This animal here went extinct in a nature preserve, not as a result of logging, not as a result of the leather trade, not as a result of human consumption. In fact, not as a result of anything anybody could figure out when it first started happening. So I think things really are quite serious, that the status quo isn't sufficient, and I'm interested in innovative ways to possibly deal with that. So the core issue here, is what's our benchmark for restoration? Now, in fact, I actually think we're going to have to deal with a constantly shifting benchmark over the coming decades and centuries. But I would like to argue that perhaps the only or the closest thing to a non-arbitrary benchmark is the arrival of humans and human impact in the New World about something like 12 to 15,000 years ago. That seems like a long time, if you think about in terms of our lifetimes. I'd like to remind you that there are individual bristlecone pine trees that are over 4,000 years old. So we're talking about something like about 3 bristlecone pine tree lifetimes away. If you want to think of it in terms of human activities, you know, that's only about 2.5 times as long ago as when the pharaohs were ruling Egypt. You know, I'll bring in some other examples that I hope will help you think about collapsing the scale a little bit. Well, we lost a lot at the end of the Pleistocene. This is from a paper published by Felicia Smith and some other people in Jim Brown's group at the University of New Mexico. And the white bars are the extant taxa, the black bars are the taxa we've lost. 58 species of large mammals in North America, 32 species in Australia, 66 species in South America, very few in Africa. And as you probably know, the time that these losses occurred are not the same. That's one of the impressive things about Martin's hypothesis about human involvement in these extinctions, is that they don't all happen at the same time. They don't all happen to coincide with some particular climatic event. What they do approximately coincide with is the arrival of humans. And there are quite a few other examples of this involving New Zealand, Madagascar, and so forth. When we hit a landmass, we take out the big stuff. It's a very common pattern. And what we're interested in is the fact that these big things had huge impacts. They played major roles in local ecosystems in terms of interactions with each other, with plant communities, and so forth. So they were once widespread. We helped wipe them out. I think the evidence is unequivocal that we played a role. Okay, and I point you to, for example, a recent annual review of ecology and evolutionary biology article by Tony Barnowski and his colleagues in terms of the evidence for that. But I think it's indisputable that we had at least an important role, if not the only role in causing the extinction of megafauna. I also think it's unarguable that these megafaunal components had major community and ecosystem roles. We have plenty of evidence from experimental biology, experimental ecology in the last 20 years that mega-herbivores have huge roles in structuring plant communities. Mega-carnivores have huge roles through trophic cascades and other phenomena in structuring overall biotic diversity. You can think of other things like dispersal, frugivory, and so forth. These are a few anachronistic organisms. This is a thing called devil's claw. When this thing is wet and not dry and ready to disperse, these things snap around something that bumps against them. And if you get one of these around your leg, you can quickly think about this is about the right size to go around something like the leg of a person, the leg of a cow, the leg of a horse, or in the past, the leg of equids, camelids, and so forth, okay? This is a thing called Osage orange. Doesn't have any native dispersal agent now in North America. It's actually quite restricted in its distribution now, and it persists due to dispersal by domestic animals and by Native Americans who use the wood for making bows and so forth. There are plants with fruits about this size and that look about like this in Asia and Africa, and they are elephant dispersed, the fruits, okay? So this is a putative North American Thomasidian dispersal thing. These are dying lineages, okay, on a global scale. On a global scale, the megafauna are dying lineages. We are losing them. Their ranges are shrinking continuously. They have enormous economic and cultural significance, some positive, some negative. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So, what happened was, I had a PhD student named Josh Donlin, who had a lot of experience from his master's work at UC Santa Cruz on dealing with introduced animals on islands. So it's a little bit paradoxical that Josh had spent his master's thesis getting rid of introduced creatures, and now he's part of a group that some would say are trying to introduce exotic creatures in places. This is Paul Martin, his PhD at Michigan in the 50s, working on herps, then became a paleoecologist. And Paul's the architect of this notion of humans having a really major effect in restructuring North American biotic communities. And Paul's the one who first said in the literature, maybe we ought to look for some proxies and try to put something back in North American ecosystems that could serve some of these roles we lost with the loss of the megafauna. What Josh and I did was notice that nobody really paid much attention to Paul saying this. The few things that were said in the literature in response to his article were sort of making fun of him and not taking it very seriously. And Josh and I thought this deserved a more careful look. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit in terms of sort of a personal journey and sort of the sociology of academia and of science that we went through in having this happen, because it's been, to me, a fascinating thing. We started out, we wrote a proposal to NCEAS, and we proposed to have a week-long workshop and bring in 24 people and really come out with a very detailed manifesto if one were advisable. And boy, they just laughed us out of the shop. I mean, it's one of the funniest negative reviews I've ever gotten for a proposal. So then, Josh and I each had some foundation money at our disposal. We cut the list in half. We asked all the participants to pay for their own plane fare. We got Ted Turner. We had a connection to one of the Ted Turner ranches in New Mexico, and so we got them to sponsor our meeting. We flew everybody into Las Cruces. I rented a chef from a restaurant in Las Cruces. I bought several boxes of wine, a lot of beer. We banned everybody up to this place called the Ladder Ranch, which is one of Ted Turner's 3 ranches in New Mexico, each of which is bigger than 80% of the U.S. national parks. Not a cow on one of these ranches, all bison in terms of meat production. So I sequestered these people in a bunkhouse for 3 days. I told them the first night my goal was to leave on Sunday with an outline for a paper. It was one of the best experiences I've ever had in terms of working with people in a professional atmosphere. So let me tell you a few of the other participants. This is Steve DeBrock, the ranch manager, works for Turner. This is Joe Truitt, the Ted Turner's chief endangered species biologist. Gary Romer, New Mexico State. Joel Berger, an authority on wild mammals. Well, Joel's given seminars here before. He's with Wildlife Conservation International. Dave Foreman, who founded Earth First, written a book on rewilding. Michael Soule, one of the founders of the Society for Conservation Biology. Felicia Smith, got a PhD at Riverside, working on wood rats, now a professor at the University of New Mexico. Dave Burney, Hawaii Botanic Gardens works on Madagascar. I specifically invited Carl and Jane Bach from the University of Colorado because they had extensive experimental grassland ecology experience in the southwestern U.S., and I knew they were critical part of Paul Martin's ideas. And I thought if we could convince the Bachs to go along with us, or maybe they would convince us to calm down, that the overall effect would be good. So that was our meeting. We sat around for 3 days. We had a mastodon tooth, I think, is sort of a talisman on the table here. We ate bison burgers. This is one of the release sites for Mexican lobos, and so the first night we were there, we went out at dusk and listened to wolves howl across a canyon, which I have to say was a literally neck hair raising experience to hear a wolf howl in New Mexico. And we left on Sunday with an outline for a paper. We never had a squabble. I proposed the first day that since Josh was the only grad student that had done the lion's share of the work organizing the meeting, that he be the first author on any paper, I would be the last, everybody else would be alphabetical. No problems, no posturing, no I'm the big shot and I need to be first, none of that. So the way we ran the meeting and the way we wrote the papers as well was to think in terms of some exemplar taxa. So we wanted to examine the possibility that through bringing conspecifics or closely related proxies, it might be possible to put back some of this function of megavertebrates in North American ecosystems. We also thought that this might be important in terms of preserving global evolutionary potential for these endangered taxa. So we thought of, I had a list of taxa that I thought spanned various problems, advantages, possibilities, and so forth, and also spanned a range of sort of relatedness to what had been lost. So I'm going to mention the tortoise last because we thought of it last, but these included horses, which most people regard as feral, exotic intruders in Western North America. In fact, I think a very good case has been made that it's the same species we lost about 10 to 11,000 years ago. The old world cheetah, there were 2 cheetahs at least in the late Pleistocene in North America that are closely related to that cheetah. We had 5 species, I think 5 species of proboscideans in North America until the end of the Pleistocene. So we talked about elephants. We talked about this lion, and this lion, either this species or it plus its sibling sister taxon, was once the widest distributed mammal in the world. So whether you call it Panthera leo or Panthera leo plus Panthera atrox or Panthera spaleo, this cat was all over the northern hemisphere and went as far south as Peru in North America until about 10,000 years ago. We had a rich camelid assemblage in North America until the end of the Pleistocene, including members of both lineages, the camel lineage and the llama lineage. And then finally, right about a week before the meeting, I remembered this thing called the Bolson tortoise. Bolson tortoise is a member of the genus Gophorus that we have here in California. The three species of Gophorus were discovered. I'll get back to Gophorus. I'll tell you that in a second. So in terms of each of these taxa, at the meeting we talked in terms of conservation value, and by that I mean a constellation of things that have to do with how important would it be to do something new with this taxon. Obviously, horses are not endangered. Domestic horse is not endangered. That species is not endangered. So you might not be so impressed with the horse as in terms of conserving evolutionary potential of that species. Bolson tortoise is super endangered in north central Mexico at the other extreme. We talked in terms of ecological roles, whether there would be clear-cut expected ecosystem roles for these taxa and perhaps costs of bringing them in as well. We talked about evolutionary potential in terms of sort of diversifying the prospects for this group of organisms on a global basis in the face of change like climate change and so forth. We talked about popularity and human attitudes towards these taxa. It's, as you'll see, a lot easier to convince people to do something novel with this animal than it is to do with this animal. And we talked about all these things, not in terms of backing a truck up into the outskirts of Topeka at 2 a.m. and letting a bunch of elephants go, but in terms of carefully monitored, carefully thought out, expert involved, local stakeholder involved experiments. Okay? And we wrote a paper about that. So we envisioned also sort of and not really stages, I probably shouldn't have called them that, but we envisioned sort of levels at which this might occur. And you might not go past one level if you found out things weren't working. The first stage is sort of already underway. There are a lot of equids and camelids loose in the U.S. right now. I took this picture in Bandera County, Texas a couple of years ago. There is a fence there, but on the other side, these things are walking across the road. Lots of horses and donkeys, of course, wild and so forth. as I'll tell you in a minute, the Bolson tortoise project is underway. A second stage might be more directed experimental manipulations, which are not at this time yet happening. But I envision, and I'll come back and talk about this a little bit, experimental maintenance of cheetah, lions, and elephants under more naturalistic regimes than they are currently kept, and an evaluation of what their impact on local communities and ecosystems would be. And then the grandest thing, which I could not have imagined happening in my lifetime, would be that eventually there might actually be Pleistocene history parks. We were thinking in terms of this idea that's been called the Buffalo Commons, where you might take parts of the central U.S. that have actually depopulated in the last few decades, that are economically stressed, where people are already talking about things like gerrymandering buffalo bison reserves so that bison could once again have a migratory lifestyle. And our thought was, that sounds great, and how about if you ramp it up a little more and add a couple of species of equids, a predator on those equids, maybe something that'll eat the pronghorn like a cheetah, and so forth. And wouldn't you have even then additional cultural, economic, ecological benefits? So that's sort of what we envisioned. So we published that in the paper in Nature, and I sort of roared through this first part because we published a much longer paper last year in American Naturalist that gives a full list of references and goes into some detail about what I've just been glossing over. The reaction of the Nature paper is amazing. It got so bad I disconnected my phone, locked my door, and did not check my email for almost a full day. Josh and I received 1,000 emails in 5 days. We did 50 radio and TV interviews, and I'm not bragging. This was not fun. I did not anticipate what happened. I got a death threat. I got what I consider to be amazingly unprofessional responses from some fellow biologists, and I'll talk a bit about that in just a second. Actually, I would say overall, despite what you might expect and despite what some people have said, the overall response was positive. Look at this. Can you imagine? There was an editorial in the New York Times by Nicholas Kristof praising this idea, and Lou Dobbs liked it too. I mean, if you know who these people are, can you imagine Nicholas Kristof and Lou Dobbs agreeing on anything? And they agreed on Pleistocene rewilding. I think that tells you something right there.
They wanted immigrants to be on that.
They wanted immigrants to be eaten by the lions. Nicholas Kristof. The quality of the coverage was generally high from the print journalist. For example, a very small-town Arizona newspaper reporter did just an outstandingly fair, critical job of covering our paper. There were editorials in The Economist and so forth. There was an MSNBC poll a couple days later of 70,000 people, 70% of which were positive. We got very nice responses in print and directly to us from various prominent biologists, including Dave, Steve Hubble, Terry Chapin, Paul Erdos, and so forth. Even got enthusiastic emails from Texas ranchers, and as a Texan, I can't tell you how shocked I was. First of all, an email from a Texas rancher, and one that was positive. We got a lot of criticism, and the criticism tends to fall into particular categories. Much of what we got critically was repetitious. People brought up the same things. This was very common. Haven't you heard of rabbits and cane toads in Australia? This is the exotic pest thing. And my response to that actually was to be slightly annoyed. Yes, I have heard of cane toads. Yes, I have heard of rabbits in Australia. And don't you, as a fellow biologist, know that there were scarcely any placentals in Australia until 150 years ago? Don't you know there were no bophonids in Australia until the cane toad got there? So we're not talking about the same thing as cane toads in Australia. We're not talking about taking extremely distant related things and putting them in the ecosystems where nothing like that has ever been before. And that is much more the norm for the exotic organism problem that we're so used to hearing about. Diverting resources from important conservation projects. And I think that's a valid thing to raise. But you know, the implication might be that no new initiatives are allowed. I mean, that can't be the case, right? I mean, I think ultimately initiatives have to stand or fall on their merits, and so they're up for public debate, scholarly treatment, and so forth. This is very common. When people won't tolerate wolves and grizzlies, they surely won't tolerate elephants and lions. And as I will admit at the end of the talk, I think this is probably a deal breaker. But I would also like to point out, this is a sort of not in my backyard thing. We'd like there to be lions on Earth, and we'd like those Tanzanians to keep getting eaten so that we can say there are lions on this Earth, right? But we don't want to have to take any of the risk, spend any of the money, go through any of the research and education it would take to tolerate and get along with really dangerous organisms. having worked with rattlesnakes most of my career, I know that it is possible to do this, and I'll show you an example near the end of the talk. I've got another one listed here. Ontario has a model conservation program for the endangered Massasauga rattlesnake. School kids involved in monitoring, all kinds of wonderful things. Here's another one. This is a little, this is somewhat poignant. We got some emails from African citizens who were just outraged that we were going to steal their animals and that we were going to steal their tourist dollars. And actually, we have looked into that. This is detailed in the American Naturalist paper, but we know that, in fact, most African tourist dollars don't come from the U.S., and if you have any idea what it costs to go on a trip to Kenya on safari, most people are not going to not do that just because they can go to Kansas and see a camel. Okay? So I think that's not a valid concern. But I think the other thing that was more commonly meant by biologists is that these animals are African, and they shouldn't be anywhere else but Africa. I'd like to point out a couple things about that. The African lion, even today, is found elsewhere. Okay? It's not really the African lion. The cheetah is not only found in Africa, even today. And not very long ago, the cheetah was all across southwestern Asia. It's still found in Iran. There's still a couple hundred lions left in Asia now. Okay? These were not African organisms even then. And not very long ago, there were proboscideans all over the globe. So it's a very shallow view, I think, to think of these as just African organisms. And I think we at least ought to consider the possibility that our conservation attitude should embrace the fact they're global. Think about, for example, Mustela nigrites, which everybody always talks about as the most endangered North American mammal. That thing was down to one population near Mexico, Wyoming. And we are now putting black-footed ferrets back into northern Mexico based on captive bred animals from Mexico, Wyoming. I mean, is that okay? We can be sure those animals, those black-footed ferrets in Mexico now are not identical to the black-footed ferrets that went extinct in Mexico near the end of the 19th century. So I'd like to convince you that we're really talking about continua and shades of closeness and time and so forth, that we will ultimately have to make some difficult decisions about where to draw lines and all that. Again, I would say that I think the situation's glummer than we would like to admit. These are two quotes from these signs. This is at the National Zoological Park. I just took these pictures last fall. Losing their race for survival. If current trends continue, will become extinct in the wild. This is talking about cheetah. So it's this kind of attitude that I share, and that makes me think we should at least be open to alternative possibilities, to new possibilities about the conservation of megafauna on a global basis. Okay, Pleistocene professionalism. We got some, what's that? We got some incredible, I have one email that every sentence starts, you moron. Okay? And actually I answered every one of these emails of Josh and I did. This particular person I wrote and I said, you know, I was drafted in 1968, served 3 years in the Army, and I didn't do it for people like you. And furthermore, my East Texas mother taught me to be polite to strangers, and your mother didn't teach you. And I really must have like gone, you know, patriotism plus mother. This guy apologized and offered to buy me a taco sandwich. One guy linked me to something called the International Jewish Conspiracy, which I still don't know what that is, but as a failed East Texas Presbyterian, it didn't apply to me. Our harshest critics initially in the public media came from the Nature Conservancy, the World Wildlife Fund, and a particular person at the Zoological Society in London. Ian Douglas Hamilton, the famous elephant expert, was quoted saying some really quite nasty things about us in the Manchester Guardian. But David Western, for example, who's also an expert on African grassland ecology, was quite positive. Like I said, what Josh and I did was to write each of these people. And I'll give you one example. The person at the Zoological Society of London was quoted in the Manchester Guardian as saying that we were obviously motivated to do this by a desire to promote canned sport hunting. This is this thing where you take the old toothless tiger discarded from some zoo, it's released from a cage, and some fat banker from New York shoots it and then gets his picture taken with the toothless tiger. That's canned sport hunting. She said that was why that was our motivation. So I wrote her and said, I have 3 questions. Did you read our paper? Did you really say these things? Did you really read our paper? And if you did, how can you possibly attribute such a scurrilous motive to 12 people you don't know, including Michael Soule? And she offered to pay to publish an apology. She wrote back and said, I'm extremely embarrassed. You're right, I had not read it. The journalist called me. I commented without reading your paper. I can see why you are aggrieved, and I will publish an apology if you'd like me to. Ian Douglas Hamilton wrote back and said, I really am quite embarrassed, but I commented to a journalist over a long-distance telephone call without having read your paper, and having read it, I now apologize, and I'm pretty much in line with you. I think there's a little message here for all of us. I will never again talk to a reporter about a paper I've not read. I'll tell you that. So I want to say just a little bit more about this Nature experience, because I bet all of you think you just love to publish a paper in Nature. And I had published a couple of papers in Nature before, and it wasn't such a bad deal. But this time it had interesting nuances. Nature published 5 letters responding to our commentary. These are the people that wrote them. I'll just tell you a little bit about what they got at, because none of them addressed the questions we raised. This man wrote as if communities are in constant equilibria, and he talked in terms of the failure of camels to thrive in the 19th century southwestern U.S. But it turns out the camel failure was due to political reasons, not to the camels not being able to take the environment. This person wrote about a couple of local success stories in Africa, and of course we never said that we don't want to see things succeed in Africa. I think Eric Dinnerstein just basically wrote an ad for a World Wildlife Fund. That's what I would take from Eric's letter to Nature. This man, who's a historian at Washington State University, said that the Buffalo Commons was overwhelmingly rejected, okay, and wrote as if we were naive about that. In fact, here's what really happened. When the Poppers published their papers in their book about the Buffalo Commons, there was a lot of criticism and a lot of negative reaction from the Great Plains. And people have since admitted that they are substantially right. Even the Republican governor of Texas, who used to criticize them, has publicly admitted that they were right, and he's changed his mind. Okay, so this is simply not true. This is a bunch of Nature Conservancy fellows who wrote and basically sort of echoed the earlier letters of these people. I can send anybody that wants all these papers. I have PDFs of everything, and I would love to send everybody all this stuff. Then there are a couple other crazy things. We submitted this as a review article with 12 authors and 50 references. And so Nature immediately said they would like to publish it if we cut it to 2 pages, 10 references, and 2 authors. And so we said we can cut to 2 pages, we can cut to 10 references, but we absolutely cannot cut to 2 authors because this is a one for all for none thing. We all did it together. We're not cutting the authors. And they said, then we're not going to take your paper unless you cut it to 2 authors. And we said, thank you, we withdraw the paper. And then they wrote and said, we'll take your 12 authors. Okay? So that was crazy. And then after it came out, a guy in Stillwater, Oklahoma, wrote the editor of Nature and accused us of plagiarism. And what he said was, this idea is already out in the literature. And he cited a paper from Michael Soule and a paper from Paul Martin. and then, get this, I get a letter from the editor of Nature, an assistant editor, and she says, these are very serious charges, Dr. Greene, and we're going to require a defense from you within 48 hours. Because we owe it to our readers, geez, you know. So I got to tell her, why don't you look in your folder at the manuscript we originally submitted, and your list of authors, so that you see that Paul Martin and Mike Soule are both authors on the paper, and that the paper this guy is accusing us of not having cited were cited in the original manuscript that you made us cut. And then I got, oh, okay, you know. But they refused to let us publish a rebuttal to the letters. Now we get to the published critiques, and I'm going to say just a couple of things about this one because it's the main detailed one by Dustin Rubenstein, Daniel Rubenstein, Paul Sherman, and Tom Gadd. And I think this is a very valuable paper in certain ways. I think this paper articulates the kind of criticisms that many other biologists talked about. So I think in particular that's useful. In my mind, this paper mainly talks about things that we admitted were potential problems and urged to be taken very seriously in the course of carrying out this initiative. And I also think that Rubenstein et al. Sort of relied on what I would call hyperbole quite a lot. They say, for example, that Donlan et al. Believe that the flora of North America is essentially unchanged since the Pleistocene. But of course, we don't believe that. We say, in fact, in the Nature paper that there have been many changes in the habitat. This would be kind of an absurd thing to believe. We know many things have changed. In fact, we think the landscape is changing very rapidly, and that's a common thing in the past. Yellowstone has certainly changed in the last 20 years a lot in terms of dominance of various plant species, in particular assemblages. But we do think that in North American ecology, in the last 20,000 years, the biggest thing to change is the loss of those 58 species of big mammals. that's the biggest thing, and that we think it's a reasonable thing to ask, can anything be done to restore that? They also have a discussion about Jurassic Park, and I swear, Dustin, I think Paul wrote that. I think Paul, I can just hear Paul Sherman's voice writing that sentence about, we've all heard about Jurassic Park. So they say Pleistocene rewilding is slightly less sensationalistic than Jurassic Park. And I have to quarrel with this because I think there's a huge difference between 150,000 million years ago and 11,000 million years ago. That's actually a 15,000-fold difference. So I can't imagine being able to say that slightly in any context. And also, we were talking about using conspecifics and closely related proxies. And Jurassic Park was about Velociraptor and T-Rex and various other organisms for which the closest living relative is a house rat. And it's relative. So I think this is not a useful way to talk about Pleistocene rewilding. Here's another thing from that paper. Ironically, an article in the same journal issue of Nature documents the increasing number of humans killed by lions in Tanzania. Well, actually, the bold subheading of that paper, it is kind of ironic. I mean, here we are talking about bringing lions back. In the same issue of Nature, there's somebody talking about lions eating people. But the bold subheading of that paper is understanding the timing and distribution of attacks in rural communities will help to prevent them. And I think that's a really important point. In fact, this is a big deal. Can we really live with things that can eat us and kill us? It's a huge deal that we mostly don't have to deal with in this country, and most other countries do have to deal with. And biological conservation, I meant to say, refused us the opportunity to reduction. Here's some things we did say, even in the short Nature paper. Our paper was called Rewilding North America, Not Saving African Mammals. For some reason, journalists in particular like to pick up on this and like to say things like, Donlin et al. Want to translate herds of African animals to Kansas. We said we wanted to actively promote restoration of large vertebrates through carefully managed ecosystem manipulations. We said a second phase could begin immediately with the maintenance of small numbers. Objections must be addressed by sound research, prescient management plans, unbiased public discourse on a case-by-case basis, locality-by-locality basis. Well-designed, hypothesis-driven experiments before releases take place. That's what we actually called for. So I want to talk about the Bolson tortoise slip just a little bit because this one's actually underway. And I think it exemplifies exactly, well, I don't know about exactly, but pretty much how we imagine this would take place. This tortoise, here's the distribution of the genus Gopherus. There's a species called Polyphemus in the southeastern U.S., mainly now the Florida Peninsula. There's a species called Berlandieri found in southern Texas and northern Mexico, northeastern Mexico. There's a species called Agassiz found in the Mojave and Sonora deserts all the way down to extreme northwestern Sinaloa. Those three species were all described in the 19th century. In 1958, John Legler discovered in the Bolson de Mapimia system of closely adjacent valleys a giant burrowing Gopherus that he named Gopherus flavomarginatus. This is 1958, discovered as a new species. Probably as males, at least historically, reached 100 pounds. It's a big turtle, 50 kilos, it's a big tortoise. Super endangered. This is the historic range right here. Now exists in only a few populations in these valleys in Chihuahua and Durango, Mexico. It's been on the endangered species list for, I don't remember exactly how long, but probably 20 years or so. Still endangered because of habitat loss and especially human consumption. These turtles are easy to eat and good to eat. But it turns out, thanks to Tom Van Deventer, we know that Gopherus polyphemus flavomarginatus used to extend all the way up to the Oklahoma Panhandle, and especially throughout the northern Chihuahuan Desert. So there are fossils from New Mexico, Oklahoma Panhandle, all the way over here, extreme eastern Arizona, Big Bend National Park, and so forth.
It's more closely related to Polyphemus than it is to Berlandieri.
Is it?
Yes.
Well, that's interesting. I forgot that. Thank you. Chuck's a tortoise guy. Undoubtedly has major ecosystem roles in terms of mixing soil, burrow mutualisms, and so forth, seed dispersal. And actually, the National Park Service talked about in the early 90s the possibility of restoring Bolson tortoises to Big Bend National Park, and they quickly squelched the idea because the Park Service had and has a policy that they do not restore extinct organisms. Now, they've already done this with the condor. They're trying to do the condor in the Grand Canyon area now, but the policy nevertheless exists on paper, and they used it to not talk further about the Bolson tortoise. So a really cool thing happened. a few days before we had this ladder ranch meeting, I decided to add the tortoise to our list of exemplar taxa. And I did that because I thought people might really jump on the dangerous animals and yet talk about things like disease and habitats changing and so forth. And it turned out that was true. People did jump on those things, although I think the danger is really the key thing. And I thought, well, the tortoise will be the test case. I mean, if people are really worried about disease, exotics, habitat changes and so forth, they ought to be just as worried about the tortoise as they are about, say, the lion or the horse. It turned out the box, that couple that I said were critical, had spent 30 years working on a private research ranch south of Sonoyta, Arizona, owned by a woman who was a turtle fanatic who had brought 5 bolson tortoises legally out of Mexico in the 1970s, built them in an 8-acre enclosure and turned them loose, and they thrived and reproduced. So when we got to the ladder ranch, Jane Bach comes up to me and she goes, "Oh, Harry, you're a herpetologist. We've got this big problem. Ariel Appleton just died, and the family wants to do something constructive with these 30 bolson tortoises." And standing right next to us is Joe Truitt from Ted Turner's Endangered Species Fund, and he gets this big grin and he goes, "Ted loves turtles." So what happened is, the next spring, there was a 2-day meeting in Tucson of tortoise experts from all over North America, including Mexican wildlife authorities. We didn't want to get into any kind of a political problem. I didn't do this. The Turner people did this. Tortoise vets. There are actually several expert tortoise vets. Because of the problems involving gopher tortoises and development in Florida, there's a real kind of cottage industry in translocating gopher tortoises, and it turns out you have to move them in social pods, you have to dig them starter burrows, and you have to give them soft releases, because if you just let them go, they take off to where they used to be. So you have to start them out like a house cat, kind of fence them in for a little bit. Turns out there's a whole technology to moving a tortoise. And the Turner people were incredibly careful about planning and implementing this. They even had a backup van when the tortoises were moved from Arizona to Mexico in case there was a mechanical problem with the first van. So the tortoises moved a year ago, September. It turned out that 4 of them had some evidence of health problems that prevented them being released, so they went to zoos in New Mexico. The other 26 were released. Here's a starter burrow right here. They were released in 2 12 to 14 animal groups that are several miles apart, each in an 8-acre enclosure in this beautiful desert grassland. And they have thrived. We lost 1 animal over the first winter. The other 25 animals have dug their own burrows and are already reproducing. So at least on the short term, it looks like the tortoise is doing very well. There are already plans for how exactly we might take the fences down eventually. So for those of you who are fairly young, I think it's actually possible that in your lifetime you might be able to take your grandkids to New Mexico and see a 100-pound tortoise once again ranging within the U.S. as it did up until the end of the Pleistocene. Rubenstein et al. Wrote a short letter to Scientific American after Josh published a popular article there, and this is their defense of using Jurassic Park, so just in fairness, I want to put that up. They do misrepresent the bolson tortoise scene, however. They're at pains to distinguish between sort of normal rewilding, which involves reintroducing species extirpated within the past few hundred years to native habitat. Neither species nor their habitat is going to change much in that time. The successful reintroduction of bolson tortoise is an example of this. Actually, I don't agree with either one of these sentences. I think things are changing very rapidly, much more rapidly than within the last couple hundred years. And this is not an example of rewilding. This is an example of Pleistocene rewilding, because the bolson tortoise was last in New Mexico about 11,000 years ago. Okay? They also assert that if Pleistocene rewilding is an optimistic agenda, as we claim that its supporters must abandon sensationalism and begin putting concrete plans for the future. And I don't think I agree with that, at least in terms of me. I'm not an expert on cheetah or elephants or lions or camels or horses, and so I want nothing to do with being in charge of releasing these animals anywhere. What I would like to do is inspire people who are concerned about the maintenance of North American grassland ecology, the conservation of cheetah on a global basis, the conservation of proboscideans on a global basis, the conservation of lions on a global basis, to consider a Pleistocene rewilding perspective and taking a broader view of how we might manage these organisms into the future. And I'll just close with a couple. I want to show you a couple more references. Here's a new paper by Astrid and Jim Brown about native fishes in Australia and the Southwest. And what they showed, in fact, is when you fence out herbivores, everything just plummets. I mean, you get enormous brush growth around the ponds, you get loss of endangered fishes and so forth. And so they talk in this paper about how various things could maintain this grassland and mud flat habitats around the ponds, but those include fire, human activity, and even livestock, or you could imagine substituting a megafaunal element. Here's a recent paper from Science involving Truman Young from Davis and so forth, and Robert Pringle from, we thought Rob Pringle's on this too. 10 years of large herbivore exclusion shows large mammals maintain cooperation with widespread symbiosis, suggest cascading effects of megafaunal extinction. Two more recent references. I think this is really a great paper, Dave Resnick and Molecular Ecology. You might think that it's critical of Pleistocene rewilding. Actually, I think it's a very scholarly critique in that it shows experimentally that just because you're putting a predator back where it was fairly recently, it doesn't mean that things can't have changed enough that the predator will now destabilize the system. Rather than resenting that, I welcome this kind of evidence as we try to come to grips with what we can have and what we can restore in the future. I don't think we're pointing to having a general theory of how long or how big and so forth, but this is the kind of study that we need in order to understand better what we can do in terms of managing FS for the future. This essay in the same issue of Molecular Ecology by Georgina Mason and Andy Purvis is really interesting, I think. And this is just a quote from there: "A rapidly changing world will be important to adapt conservation. To adapt, conservation often favors status quo rather than a more dynamic approach, encourage diversity consistent with evolutionary perspectives." And that's, I think, in line with what we're suggesting, that not that we rush out and let everything go, that we do things automatically, that we be open to new possibilities, that we encourage experimental approaches to understanding what might happen if we try new things. So I will now close with just three quick examples. There were two species of cheetah until the end of the Pleistocene. Sometimes one of them was put in the same genus Acinonyx. Sometimes they were both put in a different genus. There have been two papers published since our Nature paper came out using ancient DNA, looking at the relationships of these animals. There's actually some controversy about the precise cladistic relationships among these extant and extinct cheetahs. But what is clear is that those organisms, the extinct North American ones, the extant Old World one, the puma and the jaguarundi, are all part of the clade. They are each other's closest relatives. So I would say at this point we don't actually know whether cheetahness is synapomorphic for that clade and gets lost in jaguarundis and pumas, or whether it's homoplasius in the things that look more and more like cheetahs. I'd only assert that there was a cheetah, there were two cheetahs in North America, and they were quite similar to the cheetah that still exists in the Old World. John Byers has argued that some of the very peculiar aspects of pronghorn life history are probably adaptations to the presence of an especially fast cheetah predator. And the question I pose is, right now there are about 225 captive cheetah in North America, and they're all being kept behind chain link fences and being given chunks of horse meat on platters. And my question is, so what exactly are we doing? Why are we doing that? I mean, what I can see is that we're domesticating cheetah. Why would we do that? Why wouldn't we at least try to have some naturalistic regimes in which these North American cheetah are kept for, supposedly for conservation purposes? And what if I could find a landowner that was willing to securely fence 200 square miles and have good populations of jackrabbits and pronghorn? What if cheetah experts could tell us, okay, we'd estimate that the conservatively best mix would be, say, 6 females and 3 males. I mean, why not try it? Is that worse than having them between chain link fences eating chunks of horse meat? I'm almost done. Elephants. You may know this, but the Asian elephant, judging from the recent sequencing of both elephant and mammoth and mastodon, I don't know about mastodon, but at least the sequencing of mammoth DNA, suggests that the Indian elephant is more closely related to extinct North American taxa than it is to the living African elephant. There are also some sort of practical reasons why it'd probably be easier to work with Asiatic elephants from what we know about them in captivity. There's increasing public sentiment against keeping elephants the way we've grown up seeing them kept in captivity. The Bronx Zoo's getting rid of their elephants. I would claim that within, say, 20 years there won't be elephants in most major zoos. People just no longer think it's appropriate to keep that animal with a chain around its leg in a concrete pen. Elephants are going to be going into sanctuaries. Okay? Well, if we're going to do that, why not try something? We know from studies in Africa that sometimes elephants can actually enhance grazing by keeping down brush and promoting grass growth. That's the result of some studies. And I'm willing to say that despite the fact that Doug McCauley just shows that depresses snake activity, okay? Well, why not try something, okay? Now, I work with a group of cowboys in Arizona, New Mexico called the Malpai Borderlands Group. The head of that Bill McDonald is a MacArthur Fellow. And he really is a MacArthur Fellow, and he really is a cowboy. Okay? We had Paul Martin come talk to the group about 5 or 6 years ago, and the ranchers mostly did not get enthusiastic at that point. They're sort of like, yeah, this is cool, but so what? What does it matter to us? 2 years ago, I ran into Bill McDonald in a Safeway in Douglas. He'd just come back from Kenya, touring David Western's elephant exclosure and enclosure experimental plots and seeing the effect on grazing. And his remark to me in the supermarket aisle was, where can I rent an elephant? I spent my life using fossil fuels to pull mesquite out of the ground. Where can I rent an elephant? So it might sound preposterous, but I don't think it necessarily is, that we might actually do a little experiment. I think this is the deal breaker. I think the critics are probably right. I doubt we can bring this guy back, okay? I purposely chose a picture of a lion with that expression on its face instead of Androcles thanking, remember Androcles and the lion, the thorn and the lion? So this is a big problem. It is the case, and there's a wonderful new paper by Bruce Patterson about this. It is the case that either our North American lion was conspecific with Panthera leo, or it's the sibling species. And if you go to Bruce's paper, he gives the ancient mtDNA sequence, divergence evidence, and so forth. Our lion was bigger, perhaps half again bigger than the current African lion. Maybe it didn't have a mane. I mean, there are some things that are different, but this animal was here, or something very similar to it. And I seriously doubt, actually, that we would put up with it. But I think that's too bad. Okay, I have a few parting shots. This is a mammoth being dug up in upstate New York. This is a longhorn. We'll talk about that in just a second. The first thing is, I think we would really like people to much more seriously think about what are our restoration benchmarks. Why are we going to put something back there? And why not this back there? I mean, what are we going to do? And imagine we're going to have to deal with this in the future in a shifting landscape. I think the whole thing's just going to get slipperier and slipperier and slipperier. Most people don't know that the last live mammoth on Earth wasn't 11,000 years ago. It was something like 3,400 or 3,900 years ago on Wrangel Island off the coast of Siberia. This is not a long time ago. We had elephants in places we don't have them now, not very long ago. And you can be sure they were substantially affecting the structure of local ecosystems. Are we going to accept the downward ratcheting loss of biodiversity? I think the status quo is a ticket to further loss of biodiversity. Just look at it, it's happening. If we continue to act like every time something shrinks, okay, now we're going to draw the line there. Now it shrinks some more, now we're going to draw the line there. Meanwhile, climate change, all these other imponderables, political unrest and so forth. I mean, how can you not think the globe is in big trouble in terms of losing nature? And I don't think that's good enough. And I think part of the problem is we tend to want everything to be risk-free. We don't want to take any chances. And I think we're going to have to take chances, because I think doing nothing is not risk-free. Status quo is not risk-free. Who will share the planet with dangerous animals? Okay? And it's mostly not us. When the state of Florida tried to put mountain lions back in the panhandle of Florida after only 30 years of them having been gone, people picketed with signs with pictures of their kids saying, don't let the lions eat my kids. And Florida Fish and Game could not get the political willpower to expand the range of that animal in Florida. Okay? So this is a tremendously serious question. And again, just ask yourself, if we can't, why should anybody else? How are we going to point the rest of the world and ask them to keep tigers? Just last week in the New York Times, number of tigers in India has decreased 50% since the last estimate. We're down to less than 2,000 tigers left in India. Can you imagine this? It's incredible. I think there are some broader issues. I think there is something about professionalism in biology. All I'll say about that is, to you graduate students, I'm telling you, if somebody calls you and asks you to comment in public about a paper, make sure you read it before you do it. I think if I was a meaner person, I could have made some people look really bad in public based on what they did to us. What about rewilding zoos? Why do we have these cheetah behind cages eating chunks of meat? I really think we should be working towards more naturalistic regimes if we're going to keep animals. And part of the reason is so the public will see them under more not naturalistic circumstances. And then I said something, you probably think I'm being too touchy-feely here, but rewilding our lives. I think this word wild is just fascinating. What is wild, you know? What I think is going to happen is that we're going to have to come to grips with sort of a sliding scale of wildness. I have a colleague named Tom Eisner who sees wildness in insects on a single plant. So Tom finds wilderness out in front of our building. He goes out there with his glass and gets down on his knees, and he just gets completely carried away like we might be with a snake or a salamander. You know? I have a good friend, David Hillis, who ranches longhorns for a hobby. You know, Hillis does not lose a single calf to predators. All his neighbors ranch Herefords, and they have trouble with coyotes and bobcats and possibly mountain lions. Hillis has never lost a calf. And there's a reason Hillis has never lost a calf. You know that longhorn meat is better for you health-wise. It's much leaner. Longhorns are easier on the ground. And walking around in a field with longhorns is different than walking around. So I think these are all part of a fabric of problems, of issues. Maybe ultimately they're aesthetic issues. Maybe ultimately they're sort of value issues that we're going to have to come to grips with. And I should stop now. I'm happy to answer questions and talk about this.
I know it's quite crowded room. Some people have to go to classes. I have to go myself in a few minutes. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion, so please stay and let it go. Chuck.
Yeah, you know, with climate change likely in the next 50 to 75 years, not within your and my lifetime, but within the lifetime of a lot of people here, there's going to be changes in all of the continental United States that are going to probably redistribute the population of the United States. And a lot of that land is going to be abandoned because it just will not be feasible financially to try to grow crops in these places. So it seems to me that planning should not be 5 years from now. Planning should be 75 years from now, and we should be thinking about expanding these habitats so that the flexibility we need to rewild the continent is permissible. Otherwise, we're just going to have, 500-acre plots of dead animals. So,
and the magnitude of what you're proposing is almost beyond comprehension. I mean, it involves sociology, politics. There are counties in Kansas right now that have fewer people than they had 100 years ago. Bill.
I'm curious about the box. Were there particular arguments that persuaded them to join your final document? It would be interesting as a biologist to know what kind of arguments were most persuasive in supporting your point of view.
That is a very good question, because I've also wondered about why did we get such vitriolic criticism from some biologists, and in particularly criticism that seemed to be almost visceral in some ways. I mean, often our critics, if I asked them, did not know that there were mammoths on Earth until 4,000 years ago, did not know there were plants that lived that long, did not blah, blah, blah. It would turn out they had no idea there was a lion here. And it turned out the Box were like that. The Box were very much contemporary, steeped in contemporary experimental grassland ecology, and they had very little background in phylogenetics and paleontology and so forth. And they actually watched them transition over 48 hours from being completely opposed to it and unwilling to sign on as authors to being enthusiastic. Now, I have to say that there were people in that group that were just over the top crazy about this. Paul Martin would like to just start grabbing taxa from anywhere that looked like they could be something like a glyptodont and put it back, And the Box were kind of a welcome antidote to Paul's over-the-top enthusiasm.
Yeah,
Bill.
I'm wondering what is the ecological comprehension of the role, or how large mammals fit and into an ecosystem. Just like that, your photo or your illustration there of the elephant and the lion. I mean, they were largely separated. Maybe a lion takes an occasional elephant calf or something, but just that general principle. With this, how much science do we have behind the idea of putting these things in there? Just what's going to happen? Like you gave this really nice showing these large seeds. Who the hell, what's this Osage orange doing here, and so on. Mm-hmm. I'm saying, what is the overview of that? Like you didn't mention for obvious reasons. What about the giant ground sloths?
Yes.
But I mean, so my general question is, what is the science behind, or where do we stand with that? That's what I'm asking.
In terms of trophic cascades and things like that?
Yes, yes.
Well, there's an extensive literature on it. I mean, we know a lot about, not everything by any means, but we know a lot about how mega carnivores, mega herbivores, meso, so forth, have top-down and bottom-up effects within ecosystems. So when I give this as a public talk, I don't spend much time on the sort of academic cultural aspects of it, but I have things in it like Jim Estes' trophic cascade involving orcas and the recent shift of that involving possible effects of whaling on orca biology and so forth. So if I talk about this to the public, I always have to include some examples to illustrate things like trophic cascades and mega herbivore effects on vegetation diversity and so forth. Orange hat. Orange hat.
Orange hat, an exploding oven.
Chris Journey, how are you?
Mary.
Yeah.
Hey, I think you're missing something really extraordinary that could help politically with this program that you're advocating, and I want to say I support it 100%, but I do want to know more about it, and that is the idea nowadays of nature deficit disorder in Richard Louv's book of Last Child in the Woods, and here's what I'm getting at. Keep bears wild to keep humans humble. In any place that you have an animal that can eat you, look at the surfers in the ocean, there's a much more incredible respect and alliance with nature. And the stories of Kipling and others getting us young biologists started happen to be about these exotic places in Burma and Sumatra and Africa. And I think that if you can put forth this idea that this may be the key to saving our society of ever-expanding capitalistic growth so that there are these wild animals that keep us humble and in our places, in a way that would address the nature deficit disorder and the disconnection that's sucking us away with our compulsive communication in our video and our computer world. This is not something that somebody could turn away from and would possibly lead to another revolution in our whole societal, kind of fabric.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. On the talk I'm going to give Saturday, I ended the talk with a picture of some people in upstate New York on an eco-tourist trip to see timber rattlesnakes. And it's really a funny picture. I love it because they look just like bird watchers, except they're all... And in 1991, I was sort of I was ridiculed in a kind of friendly fashion in the New York Times by Natalie Angiers for telling her I had a pipe dream that people would sign up for ecotours to see rattlesnakes. And she said, yes, get my travel agent, like that'll be the day. But the fact is, it is now the day. We have timber rattlesnakes within small towns in central upstate New York that are potentially in conflict with people, and the thing has been totally flipped. So they're like the mascot of the towns. Everybody, there are cards and laundromats. If you have a timber rattlesnake in your driveway, call this number. They have an annual Timber Rattlesnake Day in Elmira, New York, and we have more people sign up for these trips than we can run to go out and they see one rattlesnake do nothing in 3 hours, and you'd think they've just seen a lion. They're just ecstatic about it, but it's because they've been prepped. Okay. Sorry. Hi, Michelle.
Yeah, I had a question about the Bolson tortoise. So you've got a natural experiment going on right now. Were sort of an inventory done on these plots before they were released, so that way there'd be some sort of benchmark to see,
Yes.
maybe their influence on the ecosystem then?
Yes, in fact, the Turner Foundation just were incredible. On top of everything else, they hired a rangeland plant ecologist to run the tortoise thing, not a tortoise biologist, a rangeland plant ecologist. And so before the tortoises were released, he went to the Bolson de Mapimi and surveyed plant communities and where the tortoises now live. He went to Arizona to the ranch where they'd been thriving, and it turned out the ranch where they were released, the plant communities are closer to Mexico, than they are the place where they've been thriving in Arizona. So they did do baseline plant studies, not only of the place they're being put, but also of the place where the extant population still live, the place where the propagule had been living for 30 years, and yes, they did that. And I think that's, you obviously want that kind of concern and that kind of baseline monitoring.
Yeah, and then for the future to see their impact in the new
Totally,
area. Yeah.
totally.
That'd be a powerful argument for the rest of the world.
And I think one thing that you make me think about is that you might think that what if it turns out the tortoises change the composition of the local plant community some? Is that necessarily bad? I mean, maybe not. Maybe that's what the plant communities were like when the tortoises were there. When we had this meeting, I had only been to Africa once, and I spent almost no time in the lowlands. I was in the highlands of Uganda. So I'd never been around the big African megafauna. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking about when I first moved to California, and I'd hear about how the horses and the donkeys are evil, and they pollute the desert springs and all this stuff. I mean, it seemed like the mentality was almost that we all ought to be given Winchesters and go out there and be shooting horses and stuff. And I remembered, and I started thinking, well, if it's bad that the horses are pooping in the water now, why was it okay 10,000 years ago? Why was horse poop good then, but bad now? And so I know it sounds silly, but I was thinking this myself. So finally, I asked the question out loud in our meeting. And that guy, David Burney, worked in Africa a lot. He said, you ever been to an African water hole? I said, no, not really. There's a lot of poop in the water. and the point is, that's pristine. Poop is pristine. No poop is not pristine.
Harry, I wonder if I can ask one. I want to come back to Chuck's comment about climate change, because I accept the argument that human arrivals are correlated with loss of the megafauna, but I think there's also an emerging view that the sort of interaction between climate shifts and human arrivals, at least in some cases.
Sure.
So, and we are moving to a time of rapidly changing climate. So, how does planning for climate change fit into this? Because that's one thing that's hugely different between late Pleistocene and now. And it's going to get more difficult.
Yeah.
So, where does that factor in?
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say is I consider myself completely not expert on that. And so I don't.
Me too.
And so I don't know anything specific in terms of an answer. So what I'll say back to you is it just strikes me what a tremendous task lies ahead of us in terms of being able to manage for biodiversity in the future. If on top of all this other stuff that we've been worrying about in traditional paradigms, we now have to add in relatively rapid habitat change for whatever reason, almost total loss of metapopulation dynamics due to lack of connectivity. I mean, I have a postdoc who just has been able to show with microsats the signature of the interruption of gene flow in timber rattlesnakes in upstate New York due to road traffic. I mean, so how are we going to have business as usual when you absolutely cannot count on normal migration and dispersal to maintain any kind of metapopulation dynamics? I mean, we will be literally talking about, okay, let's see, it's 2020, it's time to move 40 jaguars from Mexico to Argentina. We're going to be doing that, right? I think that the magnitude is tremendous. It's going to require the interactive expertise of people from many different disciplines. James.
Seems like one of the biggest impediments to trying to do this, one wants to, and you haven't convinced me completely yet, but you're looking on the upward side. One of the biggest impediments is the fact that all of these systems have to be managed. You
Yes.
emphasize that. The trouble is the management of natural populations is out of the hands of both the scientists and the agencies that are responsible for management, in the hands of the general public. And the general public has a very, very narrow and very often skewed view as to what real management of natural populations is. So if you can't convince the wild horse Annies of western North America that you can't kill a burro or a wild horse to manage that population effectively, I mean, no matter what we try, it's gonna have problems.
Yes, I agree with you. I guess I'd just say that I'm constitutionally an optimist, and maybe that's sort of a delusional at this stage in the game, but I'm constitutionally an optimist, and I have seen improvements in my lifetime in terms of how people regard and interact with dangerous snakes, and so I'm not willing to give up yet, basically. That's what I think. I would like to tell you back, though, that after these papers came out, I started getting emails from the wild horse lobby, from the people who love wild horses, and they were asking for PDFs of the papers, saying this is just fabulous. Finally, we've got the proof that these things belong out there. And so we were having these very enjoyable exchanges for about 2 go-rounds, and then I said, oh, by the way, you do realize we want to put a big predator back, and I never heard another word. not one more email from that group after I mentioned that anything was going to happen to those horses. We were just disconnected.
Yeah, I was wondering how much this all depends on having that apex predator. I mean, the thing about all the wild horses and burros out behind me is really nothing eats them.
Yes, exactly.
And, if you've got a lion taking a foal or two maybe, but
Yep.
the problem is getting a predator that's big enough to take down those mega herbivores is the sticky wicket.
It's horrible, yeah. It's huge. And you can see it in South Africa right now with regard to the question of whether or not to cull elephants. You can imagine dealing with wild horses not by having lions, but by having sharpshooters and a dog food industry back in this country. I mean, you have to cope with it at some point, and that's why horses are viewed as a pest, because there's too many of them under existing range conditions. It's not the horses per se, it's how the horse's population biology is affected. I honestly don't know the answer because there's tremendous, I think in this country, there's just tremendous disconnect from reality with regard to death and mortality.
Well, there's a confusion between animal rights and ecology.
Yep.
You know, the concerns about an individual animal, which, you know, not that we need to be opposed to animal rights, but that idea that it's never okay to kill anything anywhere.
Yes, that's right.
It really ties the hands of a lot of these.
Totally agree with you. Totally agree with you.
Okay.
Can I ask my question? So, were there any other large reptiles besides Bolson's tortoises that, and perhaps glyptosaurs, I guess, that disappeared in the last 10 to 12,000 years?
No, not in North America.
No big predatory
Not
snakes
that I
or
know of.
lizards?
Now, people have actually talked about, Tim Flannery has talked about putting Komodo dragons back in Australia, not back in. Tim Flannery has talked about putting Komodo dragons in Australia as Megalania surrogates. And these are big branded lizards. The Megalania was a monitor lizard that reached possibly 20 feet in total length and 600 pounds in weight.
Yeah, but the tortoises that were there 11,000 years ago were probably twice as big as the Bolson
Is
tortoise
even
now.
Bolson.
Yeah.
You mean the Gopherus flavomarginatus?
Yes.
Wow.
So,
Wow, that would be really cool.
so you know, big as Galapagos tortoises.
Unfortunately, the same breath, Tim Flannery also talked about bringing elephants back in, which in Australia, which were never there, and that's what gave me a really bad colour. Actually started putting me back on track. So look, I think I'd like to draw it to a close. Harry's obviously here for the next few days and for Saturday. Harry, thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.